usually because of my schedule, I can only go to the Mandarin. But even the Mandarin Mass, just by the gestures and like the structure of the Mass, you knew, okay, this is, and with your spirit, and this is, this is the Gloria. Now the homily was a little difficult, but for the most part, you kind of knew, or you knew, at least, and the beautiful thing about the Catholic Church is the readings are all the same throughout the world too. So you can go back and read English, oh, that was the Gospel, okay. Yeah, that's that. We call it Catholic for a reason. It means universal.
Yeah,
and
Poland.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's that?
I was in Poland and at Mass years ago, and I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I knew exactly. I knew what was going on.
Yeah, and I that's what I'm saying. I think it's kind of, in a way, that's the fact that the Mass is in the vernacular in these places kind of actually loses some of that too, that Catholicity, because it used to be whether you were in India or China or Japan or United States or Australia or Africa, the Mass was always in Latin with the Western Rite. And so no matter where you went, it was the same. You could have an African priest up there saying the Rite in Latin. You would have a Chinese priest saying the Latin. You would have a Polish priest saying the Latin. You would have, so there was that true Catholicity was involved with the common language of the Mother Church. And in a way, it's kind of a shame that we've lost that. And so maybe it's futile. Maybe maybe it might not really take effect, or maybe it's quixotic, maybe in some way. But I think it's worth giving it a shot. And so I think the other thing too is, and I kind of don't want to bring this up, but the priests are coming out of the seminary today, and the priests in our generation, they're oriented towards that too. And so I think you're going to see a rejuvenation of that use. Maybe not in 5 years, but maybe 10, 15. So I'm maybe just trying to get ready for the future too. So
some guys I know go to the Latin Mass.
Mm-hmm.
And they say it is packed with families, and everybody is dressed up.
Yep. And that kind of
the old way.
And the moto proprio kind of puts. I think it's been wise of some of the bishops that we've seen how they've accepted the moto proprio from the Holy Father, and I think it's been wise the way they've been implementing it. Again, not giving new faculties for newly ordained or even currently ordained. But I think they've really kind of understood that really things shouldn't change right now. And so what you're seeing, especially I think in most of the Western United States and parts of the Western world, is a lot of bishops have taken that and said, okay, we've looked at this, and I don't really see that happening as much here. So we're going to allow what's going on now and just keep any more from popping up. And I think it's good. I think it's a wise, prudent decision. Because I think, as you rightly say, Paul, that there's a beauty, there's something going on in that Mass, it's attracting young, large families to it. Why would you want to squash that? So not that that's disobedient to the Holy Father, because the Holy Father told the bishops to look at it and do what they thought was necessary. It was true that his intent was maybe to curtail it in some way, to it wouldn't be celebrated as much. And I think to that end, the motu proprio that was sent out was not an infallible statement. It was a pastoral directive that was given to the bishops, which also means that just as he kind of reversed the motu proprio from Benedict XVI, doesn't necessarily mean that his can't be reversed either by the next pope. So, not that it will, I have no idea. But I think you're seeing a affection for the use of Latin and the extraordinary form. Not that it's better, not that it's better than the Novus Ordo, not that it's on a higher realm than Novus Ordo, because I think most priests or people who talk to that go to the extraordinary form, they wouldn't say that either. It's just that it's something that's mysterious and kind of attractive, I think, for certain people. And I think just like it was before, the two forms are not meant to be a hierarchy. It's meant to be kind of two wings of the same being. that it's really a matter of preference. If you like that, go to it. And if you like the other, go to it.
So will there always be choices, or will?
Well, I mean, you can say there really are. I mean, so right now, if you include, let's say, the Easter rites, right, you have somewhere up to about 30 different rites you can attend here in the St. Louis area alone, right? Ukrainian rite, Byzantine, Ruthenian. Now, it's hard to find these places sometimes. You have to know what you're looking for. But you can find it and go to them, right? So yeah, I think you're always going to have that, because as many different cultures are involved in the Catholic Church, is that how many different liturgies you're going to have. So yeah, I think it's true. Now, if you're talking about just about the Western, like the Latin rite, well, up until Trent, there were a lot of different ways of celebrating the Mass. And what Trent kind of did was kind of solidify one form for the Latin rite. And that's kind of what the Holy Father used as sort of his rationale of going just to one form now. Was that, up for the last 500 years, there's only been one form. Now we have this new form. And that's kind of a part of a development of liturgy. And really was looked upon going back to the original form of the Mass from the very beginning. Kind of what they call the house churches, right? And there's some truth to that, right? So the question of these two forms, you could say, well, it's always been kind of tradition of the church to have different forms of the Mass. The structure is always the same. The way they're implemented is kind of different, has been different over the years. But now it seems like since Trent, there's been sort of this is one form, and then we're going to keep on, just going to do this for the Latin Rite. And then Vatican II came and said, well, we can maybe just do these two forms, because it seems like people really appreciate the old form, and a lot of people will maybe be engaged more with the new form. So let's just keep both, and it'll be a matter of preference. Now we're kind of get back to, we need to go back to one form. At least that's what Pope Francis seems to want to do. Will it be that way? I think time will tell. I don't know. I kind of think it's good to have options, but that's also a double-edged sword too. I mean, if you look at the current Novus Ordo, boy, there's so many options, and it's like, okay, but even then you're kind of losing some of the Catholicity as well, right? So, like, for instance, these optional memorials we have, right? Or votive masses you can celebrate, So you come here to St. Gabriel, and maybe we'll have the optional memorial for whoever saint that is a day. You go down to Joan of Arc, maybe we're just having the Ferial Day. Okay, well, I mean, it's the same Mass, the same readings probably, but there's different nature, different kind of directive involved with both Masses. And if we are truly the Catholic Church celebrate the one Mass, shouldn't it be the one Mass for everyone, everywhere? Now, that does kind of even take a little bit more of a niche when you're talking about, like, let's say, for instance, like here in St. Gabriel, the Feast of the Archangels is April 29th. And here within our territory, our boundary of St. Gabriel, that's a solemnity, right? It's elevated just because of the nature of who we are as a parish and the feast of that day. Where if you go next door to St. Michael, St. Michael would be. If you go down to St. Joan of Arc, though, it wouldn't be. It'd be a feast day, but it's not elevated to that of solemnity, right? So yeah, I don't know. That's sort of a double-edged sword in some ways. The options are good, but also it can be somewhat divisive, maybe. I don't think people have really thought about that much, because I think people just go to Mass as the Mass and praise God. People who go to those Masses are usually people that are there to go to Mass, no matter what, and so good. But from a liturgical standpoint, it does kind of raise some questions. The liturgist in me is sort of like, why are we doing this? We have another day coming up on September 27th. Does anyone know what day that is?
Next Monday. Next Monday.
It's next Monday. It's true. St. Vincent de Paul. And St. Vincent de Paul is a secondary patron of the St. Louis Archdiocese, right?
Yeah.
Now, being that that's a secondary patron, what do you think we would celebrate that day? What kind of grade, let's say, what level of solemnity would we actually be celebrating that day because of that day? What do you think?
A memorial?
I mean, it would be memorial in the Universal Church. Yes.
Feast day.
You would think.
Solemnity.
You would also think.
Or
but no.
Nothing.
The direction we've gotten from the Office of Worship just celebrate that as it was a memorial. Now we could transfer it to the following Sunday, and that's even another thing, right? This pastoral, there's a lot of pastoral applications that can be done by the Archbishop, right? So, for instance, transferring of feast days, right? So you can celebrate on a Sunday with more solemnity. There's something beautiful about that, I think, that you can kind of elevate those days. So what we could have done is we could have taken that Monday and push it back to, or maybe we could push it up to the 26th for the Sunday and make that a solemnity of Vincent de Paul. We haven't done that here in Gabriel. That's never been really tradition here in the parish. It kind of usually is given to the pastors to make those decisions by the Archbishop. But some parishes will. And so in this Sunday, you can go either celebrate the 26th Sunday of Ordinary Time or the solemnity of Vincent de Paul, depending on which church you go to. Again, both valid, both illicit, but it's like, but is it? We're all doing the same thing, right? So shouldn't we?
Would it be the same way with St. Rose Philippine Hashem?
Yes. So she's in November, and you could transfer that day to Sunday. But if you weren't to do that, we just celebrate the day as if it were a memorial. And that's even kind of weird too, because you think, well, why couldn't we just elevate to a feast? Why couldn't we do that? I never really got a good answer to that. And I think a lot of this comes up to, well, what have we done in the past, and what's the current Archbishop want to do? And a lot of archbishops don't really like to introduce new things, especially if something's been established in a particular parish. It's understandable. It's prudent, I think, in some ways. But, yeah. Options can be good. They can also be somewhat divisive, I think. So it just kind of depends on where you're at. For us, it wouldn't matter anyway. We're celebrating archangels, right, this Sunday. And even then, there's some questions like, why are we using the reading? Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to get into it. You go down the rabbit hole pretty quickly. So, yeah.
So are the readings for today, September 21st, 2021, the same that will be in 2022?
Yeah. So for today, because it's the Feast of St. Matthew, September 21st is always the Feast of St. Matthew. And so the readings, because the feasts are always proper, meaning they're always dedicated for this day, right? So now the Tuesday of the 25th week of Ordinary Time may not be September 21st, but every time September 21st falls on the calendar, unless it's a Sunday, there's always readings proper for that day. Now there's certain days that they fall, like let's say February 2nd. So February 2nd is presentation of our Lord, right? And if that day, because it's a feast of the Lord, if it falls on a Sunday, that's still proper for that day. So instead of whatever first or second, whatever Sunday would be in Ordinary Time or Lent or whatever it may be, it's probably never be Lent. But we would celebrate the presentation on that Sunday. We just had that recently with the Assumption, right? The Assumption is not a feast of the Lord, but that takes precedence over the Sunday.
No, back up a minute. If
Okay.
September 21st falls on a Sunday.
It's not a feast of the Lord, it's a feast day. And so therefore the Sunday, because Sunday is always solemnity, it's always a celebration of Easter, that always takes precedent over most days. So in other words, if the 21st of September fell on a Sunday, you would celebrate that Sunday.
And not St. Matthew.
Not St. Matthew.
What if you belong to St. Matthew's parish?
That's a different story. So the pastor of that particular parish could elevate it to a solemnity of St. Matthew. Same with us with archangels. So if the archangels never fell on a Sunday, like proper Sunday, we would celebrate that Sunday we actually had that happen a couple years ago, right? Where the actual day fell on a Sunday. And so it was actually the feast day of the archangels, and it was our solemnity here. Yeah. There's a lot of liturgical norms and rules that are very dependent on a lot of choices. There's always choices. Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. It can be very good. It can also be very difficult sometimes.
Well, it's confusing.
Yes, it is. Because unless you study this stuff, right, you wouldn't really know.
No.
And maybe a good rule of thumb would be to know feasts of the Lord. So whenever we have like a feast that celebrates the Lord itself, right? So presentation, exaltation of the cross. If that falls on Sunday, that takes precedence, right? Where's some other ones? Christmas, right? Anything dedicated to actually the life of Jesus is a feast of Transfiguration. Those would always take precedent on the Sunday. Now there's certain other feast days that do take precedent on the Sunday just by the nature of that particular Sunday. So the Assumption, Immaculate Conception, usually they're Marian feast days, but not all of them. The Solemnity of Mary, Mother of God, right? Those always would take precedent over the Sunday, but usually they're Sundays anyway.
Well, we just celebrated, didn't we celebrate the birthday of Mary?
Yes, but that would not take precedent over Sunday.
Why not?
Yeah, I know, right? It's kind of weird. It's like, why wouldn't it? Well, because it's not elevated to that level, right? Because these other days, so if they fell, these other days, like of the Mary, Mother of God, Immaculate Conception, Assumption, if they fell on a regular weekday, they would be celebrated as a solemnity no matter what, right? But the
if
birth,
they fell on a Sunday,
they would still be
I say they'd be kicked off the calendar.
Yeah, right. And but they wouldn't be. You would celebrate those days on Sunday. They would still be celebrated. But the feast of Mary, the birth of Mary, is not elevated to solemnity when it falls on those days. So it wouldn't necessarily be celebrated on Sunday if it falls on Sunday. Some other ones like St. Joseph, right? The feast of St. Joseph would be one of those days where, even though it's not a feast of the Lord or it's not something about Mary, it would take precedent on Sunday. Saints Peter and Paul, that would take precedent over Sunday. Even I think the Nativity of Saint John the Baptist would actually take precedent too. So there's really no rhyme or reason. But
so who makes these rules?
Primarily they're universal law from the Vatican.
Out of what office?
The Divine Worship, Office of Divine Worship, right? But even then, like for like holy days of obligation, those are typically up to the particular bishops of the different bishop conferences, and even up to the individual bishops themselves. A good example of that is Ascension Thursday. There are certain dioceses that celebrate Ascension Thursday on the 40th day after the resurrection, on that Thursday. And certain dioceses, they transfer it to the following Sunday. So depending on where you are on that particular day, maybe adopt Holy Day of Obligation.
Or not.
Or, well, it would be either way, whether it's Sunday or not. Or not, right? So if you were there on a Thursday, it may be Holy Day of Obligation or not. Depending on where you're at. And then if you come home on Friday, you have to celebrate all over again the following Sunday. So it's a very odd scenario sometimes. Yeah.
So the book that you read from, the Missal,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever, is there a specific name for that book besides the Missal that you read from?
The Roman Missal. It's called the Roman
Okay.
Missal. Yeah.
You get a new one of those every year? No. So you have to know then what the deal is for that day.
What we do
so
get
you
every
turn to the proper readings.
What we do get every year is what we call an ordo, and so the ordo, which just means the order, right? That comes from the diocese, and typically it's grouped in like different groups of dioceses. So, like for instance, the one we use here in St. Louis not only is the same for St. Louis, Jefferson City, Springfield Cape, KCMO, KCK. It's also same for Salina, Wichita, Little Rock, Omaha, and these other different dioceses that kind of branch from us. Not that we have like governing authority over them, but they, but yeah, they'll be the same for all those different regions. It's very interesting. Yeah, that happens every year, and so it also includes like certain like saints that wouldn't be in the missal. So maybe like every 20 years or so, a new missal may be printed out, so that because we have new saints that come in, they kind of added whatever. But the order always has those things, and so like if we weren't in the missal, like for instance, what's coming? There was one coming up that's not. There was a few we had last week that weren't in the missal, but they were saints. A good example would be like Saint Teresa of Calcutta, right? She's not in the missal. She was canonized 6 years ago. So the new missal hasn't come out yet to have her, but you would still celebrate September 5th as a memorial for Teresa of Calcutta. And what that means, you use the common for holy women, right? And their name be added in.
So possibly the next time it's printed, she could
She'll probably have proper prayers for colic, yeah, right, and all that stuff. But but they probably already have them now. It's just that you'd have to print those out and do like separate, yeah. Mary Magdalene is a good one of that, right? So she was just elevated to a feast day, 3 years ago. And so her propers aren't necessarily in the missal. So you have to print those out and do those properly. It's a pain. But that's kind of part of it. Yeah, you have to be on top of it though as a priest, because you don't want to celebrate illicit mass. Yeah.
If you celebrated the wrong thing, it would be illicit.
Yeah. Not invalid. Right? It'd still be a mass. Jesus would still show, but illicit means illegal. Right? We want both. Ideally, we want both, right? And really, anything can make the mass illicit, really. It has to be kind of willful. So when it's, for instance, let's say I'm celebrating the mass and I'm doing Eucharist prayer 2, and I say instead of like the dew fall, I say like dew drops. If I do that willfully, it's an illicit mass. Just from that word alone. Now, as long as I say the words of institution correctly, right? This is my body. This is my blood. This is the chalice of my blood. As long as I say those words, it's a valid mass. But
even if you messed up.
Even if I messed up beforehand, it may be illicit, but it's valid. Right? That's why I tell servers, like when they serve, especially if they get nervous, don't worry, there's nothing you can do to invalidate the mass.
Only the priest can.
Only the priest can do that. Now you can do a lot of things to make it illicit, but I don't tell them that part.
I would say that 95% of people wouldn't know.
Right. And the
I
point
think
is,
if you said dewdrops instead of dewfall, I think somebody may say, "Whoa, what did he just say?"
Yeah, maybe, right? And it would be illicit mass if I did that. That's willfully, right?
Yeah.
So in other words, maybe I just by accident. Okay, well, sorry. Now, if I caught it, I should probably go back and re-say the words. But that doesn't invalidate the mass.
So then what does illicit mean?
Illicit just means illegal.
Okay. And
It's not within the law of the church.
But is there a penalty for that?
Well, I guess if you get too much, you get reprimanded or maybe put in an interdict, which means that you would lose faculties in some ways.
Is that a matter for confession?
Yes. If I willfully did it, yes. So that came up in 2011 in translations, right? There were a lot of priests I can't do this, right? And so instead of really, saying either an illicit mass, they decided to retire, or they were told to put an interdict. You celebrate private masses only. You can't do public masses. It's not unheard of, but it'd be pretty rare, especially with part of that too. You have to weigh as a bishop. I think is obviously the good of the people's souls should take precedent, but also, well, we don't have a lot of priests, and as long as it's still valid, don't do it anymore. Just do it right, but come on. That's probably more reasonable. Practically would happen. So let's say we got on arithmetic, Luke 12:51. Difference between this and solvet et coagula. Is there good and bad division? Luke 12:51. Let me look it up real quick. Sorry, I'm not Protestant, so I don't know the Bible back and forth. I apologize, but 12:51. So I think it's always important too. We talk about biblical reference. We also take everything into context. Do you think that I've come to establish peace on the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. So if the question is on arithmetic, okay, so I see what you're saying. Yeah, I think there's good and bad division. Good division would be evil and good, right? Obviously, the moral aspects of that are good division. we're always open. Like, so that doesn't mean we have to be closed off completely to people, right? People can always convert. They always have a change of heart. But I think even in those aspects, it's proper to sometimes have a prudent approach to them, right? So there's we celebrated Cyprian and Cornelius just recently, right, a few days ago. And what's really fascinating about them is they were kind of the first, the bishop and the pope, who kind of exerted rights of the Holy See. But one of the big deals they were working with at the time was what to do with these people called the lapses, right? So these people that, under great persecution from the Roman emperor, they decided to turn away from the faith and offer sacrifice to the Roman gods, right? So basically it came down to either do this or you die, or your children are sold to slavery, or some horrible thing that would happen to your family. So instead of saying, oh yeah, okay, I believe in Jesus Christ, go ahead and kill me and do all these things, they said, fine, I'll slaughter a calf and whatever. There was some division involved in that discussion, because it was like, well, wait a minute. These people, these lapses, first off, they turned away from the faith first already, and some of them even kind of ratted on their fellow Christians to get out of more trouble and maybe find favor, right? They said, well, by the way, that family down the street, they're also Christian. So now after the persecutions end, because during this time, especially the 2nd, 3rd century, you had some emperors came into power that were like, the Christians, whatever, I don't really care, leave them go. And yet some emperors are sort of like, no, we got to kill them all, we got to eradicate them. They're a destructive force within the empire. And you had this constant time of persecution and then kind of peace, and persecution and peace. And so whenever there's time of persecution, we have these lapses that would come about. And then when there's time of peace, look, I'm sorry, I convert, I want to come back, right? And so there's proof discussion going on. It's like, wait a minute, these people are coming back. They end up killing a lot of people too, and being the cause of a lot of destruction and death. And should we really welcome back into the church? Because there could be another time of persecution, and they may go back and do this again, right? And I think the popes that were during these times of peace and persecution kind of were understanding the teachings of the apostles given to them by Jesus Christ, and realized that mercy needs to endure. And so yes, they've done these things, but also if they're willing to convert and just try better, we can't deny them that, right? Christ wouldn't do that, neither can we. So of course we can bring them back in the church. So there's division there, right? You had certain people, actually, that was one of the reasons we had the first antipope, Hippolytus, right? He set himself up as the pope and said, no, this whole lapsing stuff, we're not going to, no, they're out. Get rid of those guys. Now, praise God, he ended up reconciling before his death. But this is early on we had these divisions. And I think the point of that gospel is that there's always going to be division, right? There's always going to be that, right? The question we have to ask ourselves as good, faithful Catholics is, well, where is God calling us? What's Jesus teaching in these aspects, these circumstances, and what would he do? And I think the default is always charity and mercy, right? But whenever you do that, there's going to be sometimes counter opinions and counter debate, right? So yeah, I think there is good division between good and evil. I think sometimes though division can be detrimental, and I think we're no stranger to that in these times today, right? And we see that in our political aspects, even in the church, unfortunately, right? But we always have trust, and I think that the guiding principle and the source of unity for us is always directed towards Jesus Christ, his teaching and his will for us. And as long as we're following that, these divisions are kind of moot. So whether I use Latin at the end of Mass, who cares, as long as we're focused on Jesus. We have all I want to do this ministry, and this is my ministry in Mass. Well, who cares, as long as you're focused on Jesus, right? I think that's kind of the point. That these divisions are going to happen. The question is, how do we work towards the unity that brings about that harmony, and also that brings about the kingdom of heaven here on earth? That's really the goal. So good. Okay, another question. What about a priest that says the Protestant Our Father? I don't know what that means. So if you mean a priest that maybe includes the doxology at the end of the Our Father, well, we do that anyway. there's a dialogue in the Mass for the Our Father, right? We say the Our Father, and then there's a prayer of the priest, and then there's responsory by the people, right? That is kind of in line with what the Protestants would say. And so I don't know if that would really be a Protestant Our Father. Now, if you're saying that the priest omits that prayer, if he willfully does it, that would be something that's illicit. Or if you're saying that he uses maybe the Lucan version of the Our Father, which is a different than the Matthean. The Matthean version we use at Mass, right? That's the one, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. The Lucan version has the same 8 petitions, but it's used different language. Like it says like debts and debtors, right? Instead of trespass right against us. Now the rite itself calls for the Matthean version. So if you read in the Missal, it says the Matthean version of the Our Father. So if the priest is using the Lucan version, that's technically illicit. It's not per the rite. It's not per the law. And if you're willfully doing it, that should probably matter of confession. But it would not be invalidate the Mass. Like I said, the only thing that can invalidate the Mass is if the words of institution are either not done per the book or not done with the correct intention. And the only person who can have that understanding would be the priest. So good.
Is there an Our Father by John as well as?
No. Matthew and Luke are the only ones that actually give us the words of the Our Father. Yeah. And it makes sense too, because there's always a debate, biblically speaking, about which came first, Mark or Matthew. There are reasons to say that Mark came first because Mark was very brief. Seems like he was kind of writing on the run, maybe during time of persecution. So therefore, maybe during the time around the fall of Jerusalem, which was a pretty bad time. So maybe he was doing that at that time and wrote this stuff out. Then Matthew may have taken Mark and kind of expanded on it, because a lot of Mark and Matthew are pretty similar as far as the structure and kind of the stories. Matthew tends to go into more detail. Now, the argument against that is, Matthew probably was first, because first off, he was an apostle of Jesus himself. He was also a literate person, because he was a tax collector. And it made sense that he would have written his gospel probably first. But also Matthew was writing to a different audience than Mark. So Matthew was writing toward the people in Israel, Christians in Israel, right? Jewish Christians, for people in Israel. Mark's gospel is really directed towards Jewish Christians in the diaspora, right? So urban Christians who are on the go and they have stuff to do, like the New York Christians. I gotta get going, right? So it makes sense his is more brief and condensed, right? You could hold either one. You can hold either position. Either Mark was first or Matthew was first. There's good argumentation for both, right? In reality, it doesn't matter. Okay. Luke's version he's kind of trying to, so he's actually writing towards Gentiles, right? People don't necessarily have the roots of the Jewish or Christian faith, so he's writing to pagans and saying, look at this great guy Jesus Christ. He was actually God on earth, and look at all this stuff he did to prove it. And and plus the fact that Luke was a healer, he focused much more on the healings of Jesus. But also Luke wasn't necessarily a disciple of Jesus himself. He was actually a disciple of Paul. And so Paul also was a kind of a Johnny-come-lately in a way too, right? So he was necessarily witness to a lot of these things that Jesus did. He was given this great insight and great gift from his mystical experience with Jesus. But Paul's perspective would have been different than Matthew's and Mark's and Luke's, or Matthew's and Mark's. So Luke is kind of getting this more secondhand. And so that's why you can say, well, the details aren't necessarily all the same between Matthew and Luke. Yeah, but they don't necessarily have to be. If you look at them, they are the same structure. Maybe a good example of that is when James and John are coming to Jesus and say, we'll sit one on my right, one on my left. Well, in the Matthean version, it says that the mother of James and John are saying this. In the Lucan version, it's saying, well, James and John came themselves and said it. Well, okay, that's just because Luke probably wasn't there, right? And so, but either way, it happened. So, who cares, right? It's not a really big deal. It's not really a big theological point. It does maybe get some depth though, right? That shows there were actually women going around with them too, and it was not just a men-only club. But also, it's also something powerful about just James and John saying that, and maybe it happened more than once. You know, a lot of these things. You know, when we talk about the Our Father, I think we tend to think we read this in the Bible that Jesus said these things one time and okay, that's it. You guys got it. Moving on. Well, we're told very specifically he went throughout all the countryside and said these things over and over and over again. And so it would not have been like verbatim every single time, because even Jesus understood that depending on the audience he had, he have to tailor the way he does it. I think for example, for us, like a preacher, the homily I would give maybe at the 9 o'clock mass wouldn't be the same homily I give at 6:30, right? Maybe the same structure, the same tone, the same direction, but the words may be a little different, right? Or a homily mass with school children, I may not be the same as I would give with the regular 8 o'clock crowd. Still the same direction, probably the same message, but differently worded. And so I think that's how we kind of look at that and say that's the case. Now with John, he's kind of the last writer of the gospel, and he's trying to kind of fill in gaps, right? He's like, well, yeah, this other stuff happened too that you guys didn't really write about. And the amazing thing about John is he tends to focus more on kind of the last, really more the Last Supper was really said at the Last Supper. A majority of John's Gospels actually happened in the upper room, right? From basically about chapter 13 through 22 is all about up the upper room. And before that, there's some overlap, but he even adds some aspects that weren't in the other Gospels. For instance, the adulterous woman, right? The woman at the well, the wedding feast of Cana, right? Those are only found in John. So again, you have to take everything in context with each other and look at the whole picture to kind of get a good understanding of what Jesus is saying in the Gospels. So good. Anything else? Yeah.
Were the Roman and pagan, festivities set before the birth of Jesus would have been decided as to a date? Like, if the pagan or Roman celebrations were for December 25th,
Mm-hmm.
and then the nativity was put on that day, so it was asked, I'm like, okay, so when was Jesus really born?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of our feasts today are kind of basically assimilations of the holidays that were going on in the Roman culture at the time. That's true, right? So, was Jesus really born on December 25th? 0. We don't know for sure, right? There's some evidence that maybe not. I mean, the fact that the shepherds were out at night would indicate that it wasn't winter, right? Because if it were wintertime, they wouldn't be out at night, right? That maybe indicate they were in springtime, right? Some people posit that the birth of Jesus was more kind of, and the birth and his death kind of coincided at the same time. So it may have been around the Passover season. I mean, but in reality, we have no real idea about that, right? The 25th was chosen because, it was a celebration, a winter solstice celebration, a festival of lights. And there's symbolism there between the light and the light of God, right? The light of Christ that's been brought to our hearts. So that was kind of chosen because of the nature of that festivity. It's possible he was born in the winter. We really don't know for sure, right? But a lot of those feasts were established, before Christianity, sure. But also a lot of our festivities, especially our high holy days, kind of coincide with Jewish feasts too. So around that time would have been Hanukkah. Now Hanukkah is not really necessarily a high Jewish feast. It actually is on a lower level of feast for Jewish people. Part of that's because it doesn't actually come from the Torah, right? There's only 5 holidays that really come from the Torah, right? Passover, Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, Festival of Booths, and Pentecost, right? Those are the 5 holy days, high holy days of the Jewish people. And we commemorate those too. I mean, obviously Passover, Easter, Pentecost, we have those same days. Rosh Hashanah, I mean, Day of Atonement, I mean that's kind of our for Independence anytime, right? Jewish New Year, okay, we have Solemnity of Mary. So there is kind of corresponding holidays with the Christian feast days and Jewish feast days too. There's correspondence, right? Some of the lower feast days are still celebrated in the church, but we kind of celebrate with more solemnity. So Hanukkah, for instance, does anyone know what Hanukkah actually celebrates?
Tell us.
With the Exodus,
Hanukkah celebrates the establishment of the third temple. So, the temple at the time of Jesus, actually the third temple built. Right? So the first temple was the temple built by Solomon. Well, that was destroyed by the Babylonians. Right? Then Cyrus, depending on who, the king of Persia, sent the Jews back to Israel. This is actually funny. I was talking to Brother Priest about this. This is kind of a fascinating situation, study. Well, maybe it's a tangent, but when Cyrus established the reestablishment of the temple, the second temple, it was thought that by that time there were about 2 million Jews, maybe throughout the entire empire of Persia. And do you guys know how many Jews actually went back to Israel to establish the new temple? Only 50,000. And it was funny because we were talking about this, how the top of our discussion was really more about how when people are comfortable, when people are have their needs taken care of, they tend to let their faith slip. And that may have been happening at the time of the Second Temple, because if you look at some of the books from that time, like the book of Daniel and Ezekiel, the Jews actually were in a pretty good spot, especially in the Persian Empire. The Persians actually were kind of allowing of other religions. They were kind of tolerant. And so the Jews were allowed to kind of thrive in that society and even become pretty comfortable. And so the fact that only 50,000 Jews went back to Israel to reestablish the temple kind of indicates that they were like, we're good. That's fine. I think we kind of see that a little bit today, especially coming out of the pandemic. It's kind of fascinating that, I think there's a lot of people that are like, well, I was really comfortable watching TV en masse, and I didn't have to do much. Yeah, and I think with that complacency comes a lack of faith, or a diminishment of faith. So, I think it's kind of funny that was the case, but I digress. So after that, the second temple was established after the Babylonian exile, and then the Greeks came and destroyed the second temple, right? They put up a gymnasium and they kind of desecrated it, and it was a big deal. And then we had this guy, Judas Maccabees, which is about maybe 200 years before Jesus. He started waging war against the Greeks and reestablished the third temple. And so what Hanukkah celebrates is the dedication of the temple. And there's kind of a miracle associated with that they only had oil in a lamp. They were being persecuted, they were being sieged by the Greeks, and they only had enough oil for 1 day, and the oil actually lasted 8, and actually led to them overcoming the Greeks. But that's really the celebration of the dedication of the third temple. And then, of course, that was the final temple, because it was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans, and never.
So the Western Wall is part of what temple?
The third temple. Yeah. It may have been the original. Because the thought is they were all built on the same place.
Right.
But yeah, they would be on top of each other. So one was just completely demolished, then it was demolished again, and then finally reestablished, and then demolished finally. And so the West Wall is the only remnant that was left over from those time periods.
You said the Jewish faith celebrates Pentecost. What does Pentecost mean to them?
50 days. So 50 days after the Passover. So it just so happens the Passover coincided with Easter, right? And so whether you're Eastern Rite or Roman Catholic or whatever it is, the way you calculate Easter is different for everybody. But we recognize that Pentecost is just 50. All it means is 50 days, and we say 50 days after the resurrection. The Jews celebrate 50 days after the Passover, and during that time they even have the Feast of Booths. which is recalling the time in the desert when they were, traveling the desert in tents. And they would actually, the celebration includes like putting up tents in your backyard or somewhere else, and you would actually live in that tent for about 7 days. Right?
Well, I equate descent of the Holy Spirit on the apostles
Exactly.
with Pentecost.
Yes, exactly. That's what happens.
But
But
that's-
the word Pentecost just means 50 days.
Right.
Yeah. And it's 50 days. Well, 50 days after what? Well, we would say 50 days after the resurrection, 50 days after.
Well, for us,
Passover.
did it not necessarily happen 50 days after Easter?
No, exactly. It did exactly.
It did.
Actually, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The year that Jesus died. It was so. That year, Jesus died on the Passover. Right. Really, the day before. Well, it was during this Passover season, and he died before the Sabbath of the Passover, which is a high holy day in the Jewish feast. And there's actually that's an interesting point, because some people talk about inconsistencies between the Gospels and what actually occurred, right? Because John says, well, then that following Sabbath, and some of the other Gospel writers says on the Feast of Passover, before the Feast of Passover. Now, Passover was actually like a week long. And so Passover started with the slaughtering of the lambs in the temple in the evening, right? And then you had a day of preparation, and you would have a Passover meal on the first day of Passover, but the Sabbath would fall within that week. So you would have a feast every day, but on the Sabbath you had a day of preparation, right? Because on the Sabbath you couldn't do any work or do anything believer-like. So the way that we understand that is his passion started on the Passover. The feast, the Last Supper that Jesus had with his apostles was a Passover feast. And part of the Passover feast, you have 4 cups of wine. Who was it? Brad Petrie, and I think it's who wrote the 4 chalices? Was that Kreeft or was that Scott Hahn? Scott Hahn, yeah, the 4 chalices. So Scott Hahn writes about this. He has a book about this, and shows that like how the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ coincided with the Passover feasts. And the reason they had to kill him on that Friday, because it was a day of preparation, they couldn't kill him on the Sabbath. So that would be considered work, especially on that Sabbath, because it was High Holy Day. And so there's a beautiful correspondence between the Sabbath of the Passover and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so the 4 chalices that were to be done at the Passover meal, it concluded with Jesus on the cross. Like the last time he took wine was that 4th chalice that was actually concluding the Passover rite. I think it's called the 4 chalices, right? 4th cups, yeah. It's by Scott Hahn. It's a great book, and so I encourage you guys to pick it up and read that. It's really kind of fascinating, and it gives a lot of insight and depth between the Jewish traditional rites and what's happening with Jesus in his passion, death, and resurrection, and so that unification between the Jewish rites fulfilled in Jesus himself. It really is an interesting read. But Grant Preacher also writes a lot about that too. There's a lot of great. That's one of the beauties of Catholicism. We understand the Jewish roots that these all came from, and so the remnant of Israel is maintained in the Catholic Church. So, yeah, it's pretty wonderful. Good. Well, it's 8 o'clock.
Okay.
So if that's enough for everyone, I think we call it. Unless anyone online has any questions. I think we have 1 viewer right now. Going once. Going twice. Okay.
Is that on YouTube or is that on?
Facebook, but I uploaded to YouTube later.
Oh.
Yeah. All right, well, everyone have a great night. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you next week, hopefully.
Okay.
You covered a lot.
Yeah, I sure did. Good, though.
Mhm.